For 8 years of marriage, I could not give my husband the child he wanted. Every negative test felt like a small apology I owed him, whispered across the bathroom sink at 6 in the morning while he pretended to still be asleep. I counted those apologies the way some women count anniversaries. 8 years, 96 months. More failed mornings than I could hold in 2 hands. So when Daniel sat me down last spring, folded his hands the way he did before board meetings, and told me he was leaving, I thought I finally understood the exact shape of my own failure. I braced for the word barren. I had rehearsed my face for it. Then he said the rest, and the floor of the world tilted under me. My younger sister Vanessa was pregnant, with twins, his. I did not scream. I did not fall apart in front of him the way he expected, the way I think some quiet part of him wanted, so he could leave me feeling like the generous one. I reached across the table, picked up the pen he had set down like a dare, and signed the papers in my clean, even handwriting. I even wished them well. He mistook my calm for a broken woman surrendering. What he did not know, what Vanessa had spent 3 years praying he would never find out, what his own mother was about to say out loud in a kitchen that smelled of Sunday roast, was that I was not the one who had just lost everything. He was. He simply had not read the fine print of his own life, and when he walked into his mother's house that evening to share the good news, she took one look at his face, went white as the tablecloth, and whispered the words that would unravel all of it. Wait, she didn't tell you? Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. My name is Claire Whitmore, and for most of my adult life, I let people underestimate me on purpose. It is a skill, though no one calls it that. Teachers do not hand out grades for it, but I learned early, growing up in a narrow house on the edge of Cedar Falls, that a woman who seems soft is a woman people speak freely around. They tell her things, they sign things in front of her, they forget she is in the room, and in the forgetting, they hand her the whole map of themselves. I met Daniel Renner when I was 26, at a fundraiser I had not wanted to attend. He was standing near the window with a glass of wine he was not drinking, wearing a suit that fit him the way confidence fits a certain kind of man, and when he smiled at me across the room, I felt the particular thrill of being chosen by someone everyone else was watching. That was the first mistake, though I would not name it as a mistake for another decade. I mistook being chosen for being loved. They are not the same thing. It took me 8 years and a set of divorce papers to learn the difference, and by then I had built something in the dark that neither of them could see. Daniel came from what my mother used to call good stock, said in the tone of a woman who had married for love and regretted the arithmetic of it ever after. The Renners owned Renner Freight, a regional logistics company that Daniel's grandfather had started with 2 trucks and a handshake back when the interstate was still a rumor. By the time I married into the family, Renner Freight had 40 trucks, 3 warehouses, and a name that meant something at the Cedar Falls Chamber of Commerce. Daniel was being groomed to run it. His father, Harold, spoke of the company the way other men spoke of God, with reverence, and with the assumption that it would outlast him. His mother, Diane, was the kind of woman who could make you feel welcome and unwelcome in the same sentence. She had opinions about everything, the way I set a table, the length of my hair, the fact that I kept working after the wedding. A Renner wife doesn't need a job, she told me once, patting my hand, and I smiled and thanked her for her concern and went to work the next morning anyway. My job, as it happened, would matter more than any of them could have guessed. But I am getting ahead of myself. Good stories, like good traps, need patience. I should tell you more about Cedar Falls, and about the narrow house, and about the girl I was before I became the woman who owned everything, because you cannot understand the ending of this story without understanding the beginning of me. My father left when I was 9 and Vanessa was 4. He did not leave dramatically. He left the way a tide goes out, so gradually that by the time you notice, the water is already gone and you are standing on wet sand wondering when it happened. He simply worked later, and came home less, and one autumn he did not come home at all, and my mother folded his absence into the household the way she folded everything difficult, silently and with a tight jaw, and a refusal to let the neighbors see. My mother raised us on a bookkeeper's salary and a widow's dignity, though she was not a widow, only abandoned, which in Cedar Falls in those years was somehow more shameful than death. She kept the ledgers for 3 local businesses, sitting at the kitchen table each night with her columns and her sharpened pencils, and I would sit across from her and watch. That is where it started, though neither of us knew it. I learned the language of numbers at that table, the way other children learn a mother tongue, not as a subject, but as a way of understanding the world. My mother would run her finger down a column and say, "The numbers don't lie, Claire. People lie. Numbers just sit there and tell you the truth, if you know how to listen." I have built my entire life on that single sentence. Vanessa did not sit at the table. Vanessa was out in the world being adored. Where I was quiet, she was bright. Where I watched, she performed. Our mother loved us both, I believe, but she needed Vanessa, needed the sunshine of her in a house that had gone gray. Vanessa was the reward for a hard life, and I was the help, and I made my peace with the arrangement so early and so completely that I did not even recognize it as a wound until I was grown. I learned to be useful. I learned that being useful was a way of being loved that did not require being chosen, and I learned above all to watch, to sit quietly in the corner of every room and read the true arrangement of things while the loud ones performed for each other. You can see, perhaps, how such a girl grows into such a woman. You can see how she learns to let people underestimate her, because being underestimated is simply the adult name for being the help, for being in the room, useful and unnoticed, while the bright ones perform. What no one told me, what I had to learn for myself across 8 years of marriage and 1 afternoon of terrible clarity, is that the watcher in the corner sees everything. The watcher knows where the money is. The watcher reads the fine print. And when the bright ones finally overreach, when they finally mistake her silence for absence, the watcher is the only one in the room who knows exactly how the whole thing is built, and exactly where to pull. Let me tell you how Daniel courted me, because in the light of everything that came after, the courtship reads differently than it did while I was living it. At the time, it felt like being pulled into warmth. Looking back, I can see the calculation underneath, the way you can see the wooden frame under a plaster wall once you know it is there. Daniel pursued me with a patience that flattered me. He was not a man who needed to pursue anyone. Women noticed Daniel the way you notice a fire in a cold room, and so the fact that he chose to pursue me, quiet Claire with her little job and her serious eyes, felt like being selected for something. He remembered things I said. He asked about my work, or seemed to, though I realize now he never once retained a single detail of what I actually did. He asked the questions a man asks when he has learned that asking questions makes women feel seen, and I, who had spent my whole life being the help in the corner, mistook the performance of attention for the real thing. I was starving, and he offered me a photograph of a meal, and I was so hungry I did not notice I was not being fed. He proposed at his parents' house, on the wide back lawn of the Renner estate, with Harold and Diane watching from the terrace like patrons approving an acquisition. I said yes. Of course I said yes. I was marrying up and out of the narrow gray house, marrying into good stock, marrying a man everyone watched. My mother wept with a joy she had never shown me for anything I had achieved on my own. Not my degree, not my certification, not the career I had built with my own quiet effort. She wept because I had been chosen by a Renner. Vanessa was my maid of honor. She gave a toast that made the whole room laugh and cry, and I remember thinking how lucky I was to have a sister like that, so warm, so easy, so good at making people feel. I did not yet understand what a woman who is good at making people feel can do with that gift when she turns it on your husband. Diane began the small cruelties almost immediately, though she would have been genuinely baffled to hear them called cruelties. She corrected the way I held my fork at the first family dinner. She suggested, sweetly, that I might do something with my hair before an important event. She asked, within a month of the wedding, when we might expect good news, and when I laughed and said we were in no hurry, her face did a complicated thing that told me the hurry was not mine to decide. I came to understand, a broodmare of acceptable pedigree, brought in to continue the Renner line. My value to the family was measured entirely in the children I had not yet produced. My degree meant nothing to them. My work meant nothing. Even the fact that I would soon quietly save their entire company from ruin would mean nothing, because it did not fit the single story they had assigned me: the wife, the vessel, the means to an heir. I tell you all this not to make you pity the woman I was, but so that you understand the fuel that was quietly accumulating. Every small dismissal, every correction, every glance at my empty stomach, every time Diane said Claire's little job with that patting laugh. I absorbed all of it, the way I had absorbed being the help in my mother's gray house, without protest, without visible reaction, filing it away in the quiet place where watchers keep what they see. I did not know then that I was building a case. I only knew that I was learning, again, the oldest lesson of my life, that they did not see me, and that not being seen is a kind of power, if you can bear the loneliness of it long enough to use it. Here is the thing no one at those Chamber of Commerce dinners ever asked me, because they assumed they already knew the answer. What did I do for a living? Diane called it Claire's little job, the way you might describe a hobby that had gotten out of hand. The truth was less little than she imagined. I was a certified public accountant, and not the kind who files quarterly returns for a strip mall dentist. I specialized in the forensic side, the part of accounting that reads a company's books the way a doctor reads an X-ray, looking for the hairline fractures no one wants found. I had spent my 20s learning how money hides, how it moves, how a business can look healthy on the surface while quietly bleeding out underneath. I could look at a balance sheet the way some people look at a face they have loved for years, and know instantly when something was wrong. Daniel knew what I did. He just did not think it mattered. To him, my work was a curiosity, a party fact, something he mentioned when he wanted to seem progressive in front of clients. My wife's a numbers person, he would say, with a little laugh, as if numbers were a quaint thing to be a person about. He never once imagined that the numbers person he had married would one day read the bones of his family's company better than he ever could. That was his first miscalculation, though it would take years to come due. Men like Daniel do not fear the women who can undo them. They marry them, and forget to be afraid. The trouble with Renner Freight started small, the way real trouble always does. It was our 3rd year of marriage, and Harold, Daniel's father, asked me over Sunday dinner if I would take a quick look at the company books. He said it the way you ask someone to glance at a stubborn jar lid. Diane rolled her eyes. Daniel laughed and said his father worried too much. But Harold had a feeling, the kind of feeling that keeps old businessmen awake at 2 a.m, and he trusted me more than he trusted the accountant the company had used for 30 years. So I took the books home in a cardboard box, and I spread them across our dining room table, and I read them the way I read everything, slowly, completely, without blinking. It took me 3 weekends to find it. The company's longtime accountant, a soft-spoken man named Gerald, who had been at every Renner Christmas party since before Daniel was born, had been quietly skimming. Not enough to notice from the outside. A little here, a rounding error there, a vendor payment routed through a shell account, with a name so boring no one would ever question it. Over 11 years he had taken just over $400,000. And here is the part that changed everything. The part that would eventually put the entire company in my hands. The way he had done it left Renner Freight legally exposed in a manner that could have collapsed the whole business if a bank or a regulator ever looked closely. The company was one audit away from ruin, and no one but me knew it. I could have told Harold everything that night. I could have handed him the box, pointed to the numbers, and let him deal with it the way the head of a family deals with a crisis, loudly, with lawyers, with a public reckoning that would have humiliated Gerald and rattled the banks and possibly ended Renner Freight altogether. But I have never been a loud woman. Loud women get noticed, and noticed women get stopped. So instead I did something quieter, and far more permanent. I asked Harold to let me fix it myself, privately. No lawyers, no police, no scandal at the Chamber of Commerce. Just me, the books, and a plan. Harold, exhausted and grateful, and half convinced the whole thing was somehow his own fault, agreed. And that is how a soft-spoken accountant's wife came to quietly restructure the entire financial architecture of Renner Freight. To fix what Gerald had broken, I had to move the company's assets into a new holding structure, a clean vessel, legally sound, protected from the exposure Gerald's scheme had created. Harold signed the papers I put in front of him without reading them closely, because he trusted me, and because the numbers person had just saved his family's name. Daniel signed too, when I needed his signature, with the distracted flourish of a man signing a birthday card. Neither of them noticed the single most important detail. The holding company that now legally owned Renner Freight, every truck, every warehouse, the building Daniel worked in, Even the house Harold and Diane lived in, which had quietly been folded into the company's assets decades ago, for a tax advantage no one remembered. That holding company had one controlling member. Me. I did not do it out of greed. I want you to understand that, because it matters for everything that comes after. At the time, I did it out of love, and out of caution, and out of the simple professional instinct that says, protect the vulnerable thing. I was protecting the family I had married into from a threat they could not see. I had every intention of unwinding the structure later, of handing control back to Daniel when the storm passed, of being the invisible good wife who fixed the problem and asked for nothing. That was genuinely my plan. I filed the paperwork, I saved the company, and I told no one the full shape of what I had done. Not out of cunning, but out of modesty, and out of the quiet certainty that I would never need it. Life has a cruel sense of timing. The tools we build in love have a way of becoming the tools we need in war. I want to take you inside those 3 weekends with the cardboard box, because they are the true origin of everything, and because I think there is something in them worth understanding about how quiet work becomes quiet power. Harold brought me the box on a Sunday, almost apologetically, as though asking a woman to look at numbers were a slightly indecent request. Probably nothing, he said. Gerald's been with us 30 years. But something's been itching at me and I can't put my finger on it. And you've got that way of seeing things. That way of seeing things. Even Harold, who respected me more than the rest of them combined, could only name my entire profession as a vague feminine intuition, a way of seeing, rather than the rigorous discipline it actually was. I took the box anyway. I was, remember, useful, and being useful was how I had always earned my place. The first weekend, I found nothing, and I understood immediately why Harold had found nothing. Gerald was good. Whatever he had done with the patience of a man who understood that the safest theft is the theft too small to notice, repeated for longer than anyone is willing to look back. The books balanced. Every column added up. On the surface, Renner Freight was a healthy regional company, doing exactly what it appeared to do. But I have never trusted a surface in my life, and my mother's voice was in my ear the whole time. The numbers don't lie. People lie. Numbers just sit there and tell you the truth if you know how to listen. So I listened. I stopped looking at whether the columns balanced and started looking at how they balanced, which is an entirely different question, and the question where the truth always hides. The second weekend, I found the shape of it. There was a vendor, a logistics consultancy, with a name so gray and plausible it slid right past the eye, the kind of name you invent precisely so that no one will ever ask about it, that had been paid regularly for 11 years for services that, the deeper I dug, appeared never to have been rendered. The payments were small, irregular, in a way designed to look organic, always just beneath the threshold that would trigger a second look. I traced the consultancy through 3 layers of paperwork before I hit the shell, and behind the shell, patient and unmistakable, was Gerald. 30-year Gerald. Christmas party Gerald. He had built himself a quiet second income out of the company's blind trust, and he had done it so carefully that only a forensic eye with a personal reason to look closely would ever have found it. The third weekend, I found the danger, the thing that mattered more than the theft itself, the thing that would change all our lives. Gerald's scheme had not merely stolen money. In the way it moved funds through fictional vendors, it had created a set of financial records that were, in the technical language of my trade, materially misstated. If a bank conducting due diligence on a loan ever looked closely, or if a regulator ever audited, or if the company ever tried to sell or restructure, those misstatements would surface, and the surfacing would not merely cost the $400,000 Gerald had taken. It could trigger the calling of loans, the collapse of the company's credit, the unraveling of 40 trucks and 3 warehouses, and a family name built over 3 generations. Renner Freight was not just being robbed. It was standing, without knowing it, on the edge of a cliff, one close look away from ruin, and I was the only person alive who could see the cliff. That is the moment, if I am honest, when the whole trajectory of my life bent. Not the wedding, not the treatments, not even the betrayal. This. A woman alone at her dining room table at 2 a.m, surrounded by the exposed bones of a company, holding in her hands the knowledge that she, quiet Claire, the help, the vessel, the little job, was the only thing standing between this family and catastrophe, I could have called Harold in triumph. I could have made them see me at last. Instead, I did what watchers do. I said nothing, and I made a plan, and I fixed it so quietly that they never fully understood what I had done. And in the fixing, without quite intending to, I became the owner of everything they thought they owned. I have told you about the injection years, the cold table years, the grief that renewed itself monthly. But I have not told you about the year before all that, the hopeful year, and I want to, because you cannot feel the full depth of what was taken from me unless you first feel how much I had, or believed I had, in the beginning. The first year we tried for a baby was, I think, the happiest of my marriage, and the terrible irony is that the happiness was built entirely on a future that would never come. We were careless with our hope that year, spending it freely the way you spend money when you believe there is more where it came from. We talked about names in bed at night. I wanted something old-fashioned. He wanted something strong, and we would argue about it laughing, both of us certain the argument would matter, both of us certain there would be a child to name. We turned the spare bedroom into what I called the someday room. We did not decorate it, not yet. That felt like tempting fate. But we cleared it out, and we stood in the empty middle of it one Sunday afternoon, with the light coming through the window, and Daniel put his arms around me from behind, and rested his chin on the top of my head, and said, "It's going to happen for us, Claire." I can feel it, and I believed him. God help me, I believed him completely. I have thought about that moment more than almost any other, in the years since, because now I know what I did not know then. By that Sunday in the someday room, Daniel almost certainly already knew the truth about himself. He had been tested. He had received the result. He knew, standing there with his arms around me, promising me a future he was certain of, that the future he was promising was impossible by any means we were pursuing. And he said it anyway. It's going to happen for us. I can feel it. He stood in the empty room where our child would never sleep, and he lied to me with his whole warm body, and I leaned back into the lie and felt safe. That is the memory that taught me, finally and completely, who Daniel was. Not the divorce papers. Not the affair. This. A man who could hold his grieving wife in an empty nursery and promise her a future he had already made certain she would never have, and feel, I must assume, nothing at all. The someday room stayed empty for the rest of my marriage. We stopped going in. The door stayed closed, and we both learned to walk past it without looking, the way you learn to walk past any grave you cannot bear to visit. After the divorce, when the house became fully and openly mine, I went into that room for the first time in years. I stood in the middle of it, in the same spot where Daniel had held me and lied, and I waited to feel the old grief. But it did not come the way I expected. Instead, I felt something clearer. I understood that the room had never really been a nursery. It had been a monument to a lie, a shrine to a future one of us always knew was false. And so I did the only thing that made sense. I turned it into my study. I put my desk there, and my books, and the files for the company I now ran, and I made the room where my child would never sleep into the room where I would build the rest of my life. Some people would find that grim. I find it honest. The room finally holds something real. It holds the work of a woman who stopped waiting for a future someone else controlled and started building one that no one could take from her. We started trying for a baby in our 4th year of marriage, the year after I quietly saved the company no one knew I now controlled. Daniel wanted a son. He never said it in those exact words, but I heard it underneath everything, in the way he talked about the company's future, in the way Harold clapped him on the shoulder at dinners and said, "Someday, son, this will all be yours and your boys after you." A Renner man needed a Renner heir. That was the unspoken math of the family, and I had married into the equation without quite understanding my assigned variable. I was meant to produce the next generation. It was, in Diane's mind, the entire point of me. The first year of trying, we were hopeful in that easy, careless way of people who assume the thing they want is simply a matter of time. We joked about names. We turned the spare bedroom into a someday room and left it empty, full of intention. But the months stacked up the way months do, each one ending with the same quiet disappointment, and slowly the hope curdled into something heavier. By the 2nd year, the joking had stopped. By the middle of the 2nd year, Diane had started asking questions at dinner, pointed, wounding questions dressed up as concern. "Any news?" she would say, glancing at my stomach, and I would smile and say, Not yet, and feel the whole table shift its weight onto my shoulders. So we did what couples do when wanting turns to worrying. We went to the doctors. We entered that strange, clinical world of appointments and charts and words I had never expected to learn. Ovulation windows, hormone panels, follicle counts. I gave blood so many times the technicians knew my name. I took injections in the bathroom at work, timing them between meetings, hiding the small plastic sharps container at the back of my desk drawer. I want you to understand what those years cost, because Daniel would later act as though the failure had been mine alone, a thing I had done to him, rather than a thing we had suffered together. I bled for that dream. I bruised for it. I lay on cold tables with my feet in stirrups and stared at water-stained ceiling tiles and prayed to a God I was not sure I believed in. And through all of it, the doctors could not find anything wrong with me. That detail sat quietly in my file for years, and I did not think to question it, because I had already accepted the story everyone else believed, that the problem was mine. When you are told you are the broken one often enough, by enough people, in enough gentle voices, you stop asking to see the evidence. You simply agree. It is easier to carry a certainty than to fight for a doubt. Remember that, because it becomes important later. The story we accept about ourselves is the most dangerous thing we own. It was during those years, the injection years, the cold table years, that my sister Vanessa started coming around more often. At the time, I was grateful. Vanessa was 5 years younger than me, bright and warm and easy in a way I had never been, the kind of woman who walked into a room and made it feel like a party had started. Our mother had always favored her, in that unspoken way mothers have, and I had made my peace with it long ago. When Vanessa offered to help, to drive me to appointments, to sit with me in waiting rooms, to distract Daniel with dinners and card games on the evenings I was too wrung out to be good company, I thought I was watching my sister become the woman our mother had always hoped she would be. Generous. Present. Family. I did not see it. I want to be honest about that, because the version of this story where I saw it coming is a lie that would make me feel less foolish, and I am done telling myself comfortable lies. I did not see my sister and my husband falling into each other in the gaps I left behind. I handed them the time. I handed them the intimacy of shared worry over the poor barren woman upstairs. I handed them every candlelit dinner I was too exhausted to attend, every long drive home, every quiet moment of two attractive people conspiring in their concern for me. I built the affair with my own hands and called it a support system. The kindest people are often the easiest to betray, precisely because they cannot imagine doing the betraying themselves. Renata was the one who first felt something was wrong. Renata Cole had been my closest friend since our first year at the accounting firm, before I married Daniel, before any of it. She was sharp in the way I was sharp, but louder about it. A woman who said the thing everyone was thinking and dared you to be offended. She never liked Daniel. She had never said so directly, not until much later, but I saw it in the way she went still whenever he spoke, in the careful blankness of her face at our wedding. Renata was the kind of friend who remembered what you said 3 years ago and noticed when the story changed. And somewhere in the injection years, Renata started noticing that the story was changing. I have skated over the treatment years because they are painful to sit inside, but you deserve the full weight of them, because their weight is what makes the betrayal unforgivable. Let me slow down and take you there. There is a particular loneliness to a fertility clinic waiting room. Everyone there wants the same impossible thing, and no one will look at anyone else, because to look is to see your own desperation reflected back. I learned the rhythm of that room intimately over 3 years. The check-in, the wait, the call of my name, the cold gel, the screen turned away from me, the technician's careful neutral face, that I learned to read like a balance sheet, searching it for the truth the words would not say. I learned which nurses were kind and which were merely efficient. I learned to schedule the appointments that required fasting for early morning, so I would not have to think about them all day. I learned to take the injections myself, in the thigh, in the abdomen, timing them to the hour, and I learned to do it in the bathroom at work between meetings, so that Diane's insistence that a Renner wife needed no job would not also cost me the small dignity of my own paycheck. The hormones changed me. I want to be honest about that, because Daniel would later use it as a weapon, would later tell people that I had become difficult, distant, hard to live with. as though the medicine I was taking to give him the child he demanded were a character flaw. The injections flooded my body with chemicals that made me weep at commercials and rage at nothing, and lie awake at 3 in the morning with my heart pounding for no reason my mind could name. I endured it. I endured it month after month, and each month ended the same way, with a single line where there should have been two, with the particular grief of a hope that renews itself only to die again on schedule. A small monthly funeral I attended alone. And this is where Vanessa comes back into the story, and where, knowing what I know now, I can barely stand to tell it. Because it was during these years, the worst years, that my sister became a fixture in my home. She would come by after appointments, ostensibly to check on me, and she was so good at it, so warm, so present, bringing soup and gossip and light into a house that had gone as gray as our mother's. When I was too wrung out from the hormones to be any kind of company, Vanessa would keep Daniel entertained. She would cook for him, play cards with him, sit up talking with him while I slept the drugged sleep of a woman whose body was at war with itself. "Go rest," she would tell me, tucking me in like the older sister she had never been. "I'll keep Daniel company. Don't you worry about a thing." And I would climb the stairs, grateful beyond words for a sister who had finally, in my hour of need, become family. I built it. I keep coming back to this, because it is the thing I cannot forgive myself for, even now, even knowing that the fault was theirs and not mine. I handed them every hour. I handed them the intimacy of shared concern, the long evenings, the empty house, the perfect cover of a sick wife asleep upstairs. When I think of those nights now, me drugged and grieving in the dark, the two of them downstairs building the affair that would eventually carry my sister's children, I feel a vertigo that has no bottom. They were not comforting me. They were using my grief as a curtain. And the cruelest part, the part that took me years to fully absorb, is that I would have kept handing them the hours forever, because I could not conceive, I literally could not imagine, that the two people I trusted most in the world were capable of what they were doing right in front of me. The trust was the trap. It is always the trust that is the trap. It was Renata who said the sentence that started everything unraveling, though neither of us knew it at the time. We were at a coffee shop downtown, the kind with mismatched chairs and a chalkboard menu, and I was telling her about the latest round of treatments, the latest failure, the latest dinner, where Diane had looked at me like a defective appliance still under warranty. Renata listened the way she always did, with her whole sharp attention, and when I finished she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Claire, has anyone actually tested Daniel?" I laughed. I remember laughing, because the question seemed almost quaint. Of course they had tested Daniel. It was the natural first step, except, and this is the moment the ground first shifted, though I did not feel it yet, when I reached for the memory of that test, of the appointment, of the result. I found nothing there. A blank space where a fact should have been. I had assumed. Everyone had assumed, Daniel had assured me, early on, that he had gotten checked out, and everything was fine on his end, and I had believed him the way you believe your husband, without demanding to see the paperwork. Why would I demand paperwork? We were a team. We were in it together. So I told Renata, yes, of course, he was fine, and I changed the subject, and I did not think about it again for a long time. But Renata thought about it. That was the thing about Renata. She filed away the loose threads, and she pulled on them when I was not looking. I did not know it then, but that afternoon in the coffee shop, my closest friend began, very quietly, to investigate my marriage. She did it out of love, and out of that forensic instinct we shared, and out of a suspicion she could not yet prove. It would take her nearly 2 years, and what she eventually handed me would not be a thread. It would be the whole tapestry, and every ugly figure woven into it. The years passed the way hard years do, slowly in the living, fast in the remembering. The treatment stopped working, or rather, they kept not working, and eventually the doctors began using words like options and alternatives and, finally, in a voice trained to be gentle, acceptance. Daniel grew distant in increments so small I mistook each one for stress. He worked late. He traveled for the company more than the company seemed to require. He stopped reaching for me in the dark, and I, exhausted and heartsick, and carrying the full weight of a failure I believed was mine, told myself it was the strain of the wanting. Grief does strange things to a marriage, I reasoned. We would find our way back. I did not know that he had already found his way somewhere else. I did not know that somewhere else was my sister. Vanessa, during those years, seemed to bloom. She had always been the brighter of us two, but now there was something else about her. A glow, a secret contentment, a way of touching her own stomach absently when she thought no one was watching. I noticed it the way you notice weather. I even felt, God help me, a flicker of happiness for her. I thought perhaps she had met someone. She was cagey about her personal life, deflecting my gentle questions with a laugh and a change of subject, and I respected it, because I knew what it was to guard a tender thing. When she finally told me, over lunch one bright afternoon, that she was pregnant, I cried. I cried with joy for her, and then I went home and cried alone for a different reason, because her happiness was the exact shape of the hole in my own life. I hugged my sister and told her she would be a wonderful mother. I meant it. That is the part that still takes my breath away, when I let myself remember it. I meant every word. She let me believe a lie to my face, and she let me celebrate it. She sat across from me and accepted my joy for her, knowing whose children she carried. There are betrayals that break your heart, and there are betrayals that rearrange your understanding of what a person is. That lunch was both. The reveal, Daniel's reveal, the divorce, the twins, the whole architecture of it, came 8 months later, on an ordinary Tuesday in spring. But before I tell you about that Tuesday, I need to tell you what Renata found. Because by the time Daniel slid those papers across the table, I already knew. I had known for 3 weeks, and that is why I did not scream. That is why I signed with a steady hand. A woman who has had 3 weeks to read the fine print of her own betrayal does not scream. She prepares. Let me tell you properly about Renata Cole, because she deserves more than the sketch I have given you, and because a story about betrayal ought to also be a story about the rare, fierce loyalty that betrayal throws into relief. I met Renata in my first month at the accounting firm, before Daniel, before any she brought it to me, knowing, watching me live my life beside a man who had engineered my erasure, and saying nothing until she was certain. I kept asking myself if I had the right, she said, to detonate your whole life. And then I realized the question was backwards. Your life was already detonated. You just hadn't heard the explosion yet. All I could do was decide whether you'd hear it from a friend or find the wreckage alone. That is Renata. That is the friend I nearly lost track of in my marriage to a man who never remembered a single thing I said, and who I will spend the rest of my life being grateful for. When people ask me how I survived it all, they expect me to say something about strength, or faith, or numbers. But the truest answer is smaller and more human than that. I survived it because one person saw me clearly and refused to look away. There is a question that has haunted me more than any other in the years since, and it is not how could they, or why me, or even what did I do to deserve it. The question that keeps me up some nights is simpler and more uncomfortable. How did I not see it? I, who read balance sheets for a living, who caught Gerald's 11-year theft in 3 weekends, who could look at a company's books and know instantly when something was wrong. How did I fail to read the far simpler ledger of my own marriage? I have made my peace with the answer, but the answer is not comfortable, and I share it because I think many of you will recognize it. The signs were there. They were always there. I simply taught myself, with great and sustained effort, not to see them, because seeing them would have required me to act, and acting would have meant losing the only life I believed I could have. Daniel grew distant, and I called it stress. He traveled more than the company required, and I called it ambition. He stopped reaching for me in the dark, and I called it the strain of our grief. My sister became a fixture in my home during the exact years my marriage was dying, and I called it family. Every single sign I explained away, not because I was stupid, I have never been stupid, but because I was afraid. And fear is a far more powerful blinder than stupidity ever was. A stupid woman misses the signs. A frightened woman sees them and looks away, and the looking away is a choice, made 100 times a day, until it becomes a habit, until it becomes a way of life. I remember one evening, perhaps a year before the end, when I came home early from an appointment, and found Vanessa's car in the driveway, and the two of them in the kitchen, and there was something in the air when I walked in. A charge, a quickness in how they stepped apart, a laugh that cut off half a second too late. I felt it. My body felt it before my mind would allow the feeling a name. And then Vanessa turned to me with her warm, easy smile and said she had just stopped by to drop off soup. And Daniel said something about the game, and I let the moment close over itself like water over a stone, because the alternative, the naming of what my body had felt, was unthinkable. I had trained myself so thoroughly not to see that I could stand in the very room where it was happening and unsee it in real time. I tell you this not to blame myself. I have done enough of that for one lifetime, and I have set it down. I tell you this because I suspect some of you are standing in your own kitchens right now, feeling a charge in the air you have taught yourself not to name, explaining away a distance, a lateness, a laugh that cuts off half a second too late. And I want to say to you, gently, as someone who paid the full price for looking away, the numbers do not lie. People lie. And the ledger of a life, like the ledger of a company, tells the truth to anyone brave enough to read it without flinching. I was not brave enough for a long time. Renata was brave enough for me, until I could be brave for myself. Not everyone has a Renata. If you are reading your own ledger right now and finding entries that do not balance, I hope you will be braver than I was, and sooner. It is the most loving thing you can do for yourself, even when, especially when, it is the last thing you want to do. Let me take you fully inside the night Renata brought the folder, because it is the hinge of my whole life, the moment that divides the woman I was from the woman I became, and I have never told it in complete detail until now. It was a Thursday in early spring, the kind of evening when the light lingers longer than you expect, and makes you feel, briefly, that the hard season is ending. Daniel had left after dinner for one of his warehouse nights, kissing my cheek on the way out with the automatic affection of a man performing a marriage. I had not yet learned that the performance was all there was. I was doing dishes when Renata called and asked if she could come by, and something in her voice, a carefulness, a weight, made me set down the plate I was holding and say yes before she had finished asking. I did not know what was coming, but some watching part of me, the part that reads the room, knew that something was. She arrived 20 minutes later with the leather folder under her arm, and I made us tea, because that is what I do, because the small rituals are how I hold myself together, and because some instinct told me we would both need something to do with our hands. I remember the specific ordinariness of it, with a clarity that still aches. The kettle's rising whistle, the two mismatched mugs, the way the steam curled up between us as we sat at the kitchen table. I remember that Renata did not touch her tea. She wrapped both hands around the mug for the warmth of it, but she did not drink, and that detail, small as it was, told me that whatever she had come to say was large enough to close her throat. She looked at me for a long moment before she spoke, and then she said the thing I have already told you, the truest and kindest thing anyone has ever said to me, that she loved me, that she had wrestled with whether to come at all, but that I deserved the truth more than I deserved to be comfortable. And then she opened the folder. I want you to understand that in the space of the next 20 minutes, sitting at my own kitchen table, with a mug of tea going cold in front of me, I lost one entire life and was handed another. Before the folder opened, I was a woman grieving her own body, carrying a failure she believed was hers, married to a man she trusted, blessed with a sister she loved. After the folder closed, I was none of those things. The failure was not mine. It had never been mine. The man I trusted had engineered it. And the sister I loved had spent 3 years betraying me in my own home. 20 minutes, one folder, 2 lives, divided as cleanly as a cell splitting in the dark. I did not cry. I have told you that, and I have told you why. That the grief was too large to fit through the small door of tears. But I want to tell you what I did feel, in that kitchen, as Renata turned the pages, because it was not what either of us expected. As the truth assembled itself in front of me, document by document, I felt the grief, yes, vast and cold. But underneath the grief, rising slowly, I felt something else. I felt myself waking up. Every faculty I had spent 8 years dimming in order to survive my marriage. The watching, the reading, the forensic clarity, the numbers person my mother had raised at her kitchen table, all of it came flooding back at once, roaring up from wherever I had buried it. By the time Renata reached the last page, I was no longer only a betrayed wife. I was the sharpest forensic accountant in the state, looking at a problem she knew exactly how to solve, feeling her own long-dormant power surge back into her hands. Renata saw it happen. She told me later that she watched my face change over those 20 minutes, watched the grief arrive, and then watched something harder and clearer settle in behind it, and that by the end, she was no longer worried she had broken me. "I came to your house afraid I was handing you a bomb," she said, "and by the time I left, I understood I'd handed you a set of keys." Renata came to my house on a Thursday, 3 weeks before the Tuesday that would end my marriage. She came in the evening, after Daniel had left for one of his increasingly frequent late nights at the warehouse, and she carried a leather folder under her arm, the way a surgeon carries bad news into a waiting room, carefully and with dread. I made us tea. I remember the ordinary comfort of the kettle, the 2 cups, the small domestic ritual of it, because it was the last hour of my life in which I still believed I understood the man I had married. Renata set the folder on my kitchen table and did not open it right away. Instead, she looked at me and said, "Before I show you this, I need you to know that I love you, and that I wrestled with whether to bring it to you at all. But you are my friend, and you deserve the truth more than you deserve to be comfortable." Then she opened the folder, and my life divided cleanly into before and after. She had started, as I said, with the simple question no one had asked. Had Daniel ever actually been tested? Renata, being Renata, had not simply wondered. She had a cousin who worked in medical records, and while she would never tell me exactly how she came by what she came by, she laid before me a document that answered the question with brutal finality. Daniel had been tested, years ago, early in our struggle, before the injections, before the cold tables, before all of it. He had gone alone, told me it was routine, and received a result he never shared with me or with any doctor treating us as a couple. The result was not ambiguous. Daniel could not father a child through the ordinary means we had spent years and tears and my own bruised body pursuing. He had known, from nearly the beginning, that the problem was not mine, and he had let me believe it was. He had let his mother believe it was. He had stood beside me at dinner after dinner, and let them look at me like the broken one, when he held the truth folded in a drawer somewhere, guarding his own pride at the cost of my dignity. I did not cry when I read it. I have thought a great deal about why. I think it was because the grief was so large it could not fit through the small door of tears. Instead, I felt something colder and clearer settle over me, a kind of terrible clarity, like the moment the anesthetic wears off, and you finally feel the true shape of the wound. All those years, all those apologies whispered over the bathroom sink, all that self-blame I had swallowed like a daily medicine. And he had known. But Renata was not finished. She turned the page, and the second document was worse, if worse was possible. Because if Daniel could not father children in the ordinary way, then the twins my sister carried, the twins Daniel would soon claim with such pride, had come from somewhere. And Renata, pulling her patient threads, had found the somewhere. There was a fertility clinic 2 hours away, in a city where the Renners knew no one, where a man and a woman had quietly undergone a procedure, using a donor, and a great deal of money routed, cleverly, through one of the company's vendor accounts. The dates told the whole story. The affair had not begun in the loneliness of my failed treatments, as I might have forgiven, barely, in some distant future. It had begun 3 years earlier. 3 years. During the very height of my own treatments, during the months I sat in waiting rooms while my sister drove me home afterward and comforted me, Daniel and Vanessa had already been together. They had already been planning. The nights Vanessa spent distracting Daniel, so I could rest, were not distraction. They were the affair itself, conducted in my own home, funded by the company I secretly owned, while I bled for a child with a man who had made certain I could never have one with him. I sat with that for a long time. Renata sat with me, not speaking, letting the silence hold what words could not. And somewhere in that silence, the grief finished its slow work, and something else took its place. Not rage. Rage is loud and stupid, and easily managed by the people it targets. What I felt was quieter and far more dangerous. I felt the click of a lock turning. I felt the numbers person wake up. Because here is what Daniel did not know, what Vanessa did not know, what not even Renata fully understood yet, as she sat in my kitchen believing she had brought me the worst news of my life. They thought they were about to take everything from me, the marriage, the family, the future, the last shred of my dignity. They had planned it as a clean amputation, the divorce, the twins, the fresh start, the barren wife left behind to fade quietly out of the family story. What they did not know was that everything they were about to fight over, the company, the house Diane so proudly kept, the lifestyle Daniel wore like a birthright, none of it was theirs to keep. It was mine. It had been mine for years, sitting quietly inside a holding structure I had built with my own hands to save them, waiting. They were about to divorce a woman who owned the ground they stood on, and they had no idea. I want to tell you what I did with those 3 weeks, because this is the part of the story where a lesser woman panics, and I did not panic. I have been asked since, by the few people who know the whole truth, whether I was tempted to confront him that very night, to throw Renata's folder on the table and watch his face come apart. I was not. Confrontation is a release, and release is a luxury you pay for later. I did not want the momentary satisfaction of his shock. I wanted the permanent satisfaction of his ruin, and those are 2 very different projects requiring 2 very different temperaments. So I said nothing. That was the hardest thing I have ever done, harder than the injections, harder than the cold tables. For 3 weeks I woke up beside a man I now knew had orchestrated the erasure of my dignity, and I made his coffee, and I asked about his day, and I watched him lie to me across the breakfast table with an ease that told me he had been doing it for years. I learned something about Daniel in those 3 weeks that I had never let myself see in 8 years of marriage. He was a natural liar. Not a nervous one, a comfortable one. Lying came to him the way breathing comes to the rest of us, unconscious and constant. I had mistaken that smoothness for confidence when I fell in love with him. Now I saw it for what it was. I used the time. Of course I used the time. I am an accountant. I do not waste a resource, and 3 weeks of a guilty man's ignorance is a resource of enormous value. I gathered Renata's documents into something a court could not wave away, and I waited for Daniel to make his move, because I knew that when he did, he would do it from a position of imagined strength, and imagined strength is the easiest kind to collapse. I also, in those 3 weeks, made a decision about Harold. Daniel's father was not a good man, exactly. He had built his life on the assumption that his son would inherit a kingdom, and he had never once questioned whether I was more than a vessel for the next heir. But Harold had trusted me, years ago, with the books. He had been kind to me in his gruff, distracted way. And Harold, unlike his son, had no idea what was coming. I decided that Harold would not be spared, exactly, but that he would not be my target. My target was Daniel, and the sister who had smiled at me across a lunch table while carrying the proof of her betrayal. Harold and Diane would simply be standing too close when it came down. That is the trouble with building your life on someone else's foundation. When the foundation decides to leave, the whole house comes with her. Let me ask you something, before I tell you about the Tuesday. If you had been me, if you had learned, in a single evening, that the man you had bled for had engineered your humiliation, that your own sister had carried his children in secret, that they had been laughing behind your grief for 3 years, what would you have done? Would you have screamed? Would you have thrown the folder and demanded answers and given them the satisfaction of your pain? Or would you have done what I did, gone quiet, gone cold, and started to build the trap? I have turned this question over many times, and I still do not know if what I did makes me strong or makes me something I do not have a name for. Tell me in the comments what you would have done. I mean it. I have never been more curious about anything. The Tuesday came the way ordinary days come, with no sense of their own weight. Daniel asked me to sit down at the kitchen table after dinner. He folded his hands. He wore the face he wore before board meetings, the serious but reasonable face, and I understood that he had rehearsed this, that he had chosen his words in advance, that in his mind this was a difficult but noble thing he was about to do. He told me our marriage had run its course. He told me these things happen, that we had grown apart, that he would always care for me, and then, with the particular cruelty of a man who mistakes confession for honesty, he told me about Vanessa, and the twins, and the life he was leaving to build. He slid the papers across the table. He had already signed them. All that remained was me. I have told you what I did with the 3 weeks, the planning, the lawyer, the gathering of documents. But I have not told you what I did with the nights, and the nights were their own separate ordeal, because the nights were when the woman fell away, and only the wound was left. During the days, I was the machine. I was the forensic accountant, cold and clear, building the case, moving the pieces, performing the marriage so flawlessly that Daniel suspected nothing. The daytime work was almost a mercy, because it gave the pain somewhere to go, channeled it into columns and documents and phone calls with Priya. But at night, lying in the dark beside the man who had engineered my erasure, listening to him breathe the easy breath of a man with a clear conscience, I had no columns to hide in. There was only me, and the truth, and the vast dark shape of everything I had lost. I did not cry, even then. I have wondered whether that is a strength or a kind of damage, and I have decided it does not matter which. What I did instead, on those long nights, was remember. I would lie very still and walk backward through the 8 years, re-examining every memory now that I finally had the key to decode it. The dinner where Vanessa and Daniel had a private joke I did not understand. I understood it now. The work trip that ran 2 days longer than the conference. I understood that now too. The night I came home early to the charge in the kitchen air. The someday room. His arms around me, his lie in my hair. One by one I took out the memories and turned them over and saw them true, and it was like watching a film I had seen 100 times and only now noticing that the story had always been about something other than what I believed. It was a grief, yes, but it was also, strangely, a restoration. I was getting my own life back, the real version of it, the true accounting, even as I mourned the false version I had loved. And somewhere in those nights, I made a decision that I have never regretted. I decided that I would not let what they did to me turn me into them. I lay in the dark and I felt the pull of it, the hunger to hurt them the way they had hurt me, to make Daniel feel the exact humiliation I had felt, to make Vanessa weep the way I could not. I felt how easy it would be, with the power I now held, to be cruel, and I decided on those nights that I would take everything that was mine and I would let the truth do its complete and devastating work, but I would not descend into cruelty for its own sake. I would win, and I would win totally, but I would win as myself, as the watcher, the numbers person, the woman who protects the vulnerable thing, and not as some new creature they had made in the image of their own emptiness. That decision, made in the dark beside my sleeping husband, is the thing I am proudest of in this entire story. Not the company, not the reckoning. The decision, made when no one was watching and cruelty was fully within my reach, to remain who I had always been. By the time the Tuesday came, I had made my peace with all of it in those nights. That is the real reason my hand did not shake when I signed. It was not coldness, though it looked like coldness from the outside. It was that I had already grieved, already remembered, already decided who I would be. I had done all of it privately, in the dark, in the 3 weeks Daniel gave me by not knowing I knew. He thought he was springing a surprise on me at that kitchen table. He did not understand that he had given me the greatest gift a betrayer can give the betrayed. Time. Time to grieve before the blow lands. Time to prepare. Time to decide, in the quiet, exactly who you are going to be when the storm finally arrives. By the time he slid the papers across the table, the storm was already over inside me. All that remained was the paperwork. I have told you that I said nothing for 3 weeks, and that it was the hardest thing I have ever done. Let me make you feel the length of those weeks, because they are the true test of the woman this story is about, harder than any confrontation could have been. Every morning I woke beside him. That is the detail people cannot quite hold when I tell them, that I did not flee to a hotel, did not lock him out, did not spend the 3 weeks in righteous separation. I stayed in the bed. I made the coffee. I did it because a woman who suddenly changes her behavior alerts the people watching her, and I could not afford to be watched, not now, not when so much depended on Daniel continuing to believe that I saw nothing, knew nothing, was nothing but the soft wife asleep upstairs. So I performed the marriage. I performed it better in those 3 weeks than I had in years, because now every gesture had a purpose. I asked about his day and listened to his lies and filed each one away. I let him kiss my cheek. I made his favorite dinner one evening and watched him eat it across the table, where he would soon slide me the papers, and I thought about the clinic, and the vendor accounts, and my sister's hand on her stomach, and I smiled at my husband and asked if he wanted more. I learned things in those 3 weeks that a wife does not usually get to learn, the things you only see when you are looking at someone who does not know they are being looked at, through eyes that have finally been cleared of love. I watched Daniel take a call in the other room and heard the change in his voice, the warmth he had not offered me in years, and I knew he was speaking to Vanessa, and I did not confront him. I let him think the closed door was enough. I watched him move money one night on his laptop, his face lit blue in the dark, and I did not yet know the full shape of what he was doing, but I noted it, the way Renata had taught me to note things, without reaction, for later. I watched a man dismantle a marriage while believing himself to be its only honest party, and I understood at last that Daniel was not a villain in the way stories usually mean it. He was something more ordinary and more frightening, a man who had never once, in his whole charmed life, been made to feel the weight of another person's reality. To Daniel, other people were weather, pleasant or inconvenient, but never quite real. I had married a man to whom I had never fully existed. The 3 weeks taught me that, and the teaching was its own grief, layered underneath the larger one. And then the Tuesday, which I have told you about, but which I want to give you again, now that you know the full weight I carried into it. When Daniel asked me to sit down at the table, I already knew every word he was going to say. I knew about Vanessa. I knew about the twins. I knew about the clinic and the money and the 3 years of it. I had known for 3 weeks, and I had built, in those 3 weeks, the entire quiet machinery of his undoing. So when he folded his hands and put on his board-meeting face and began to speak, I was not receiving news. I was watching a man walk, with great confidence, into a room I had already sealed behind him. He thought he was ending our marriage. He was signing the last document he would ever sign as a man who owned anything. And when he slid the papers across the table, and I picked up the pen, my hand did not shake, and I want you to understand why it did not shake. It did not shake because I was not losing. For the first time in 8 years, sitting at that table with my whole life apparently collapsing around me, I was not the one losing. And some deep, quiet, watching part of me, the girl at her mother's table, the woman alone with the box of books at 2 a.m, knew it, and was, God help me, at peace. I signed. I have already told you that I signed, but I want you to sit inside the moment with me, because it is the hinge on which everything turns. Daniel expected one of 2 reactions. He expected tears, the collapse of a woman losing everything, and he had prepared his gentle, magnanimous face for it. Or he expected fury, and he had prepared his reasonable, wounded patience for that. What he had not prepared for, what no rehearsal could have readied him for, was calm. I picked up the pen. I read the papers, slowly, the way I read everything, and I let him watch me read them, and I saw the first flicker of unease cross his face when he realized I was not going to perform for him. Then I signed my name in my clean, even hand, and I set the pen down, and I said, I hope she makes you happy, Daniel. I hope the children are healthy. And I smiled. The smile unsettled him more than screaming would have. I watched it land. For just a moment, some animal part of his brain sensed that a smile was the wrong thing, that a woman being handed her own erasure does not smile unless she knows something, but the thought could not find purchase in a man so certain of his own victory, and it slid away. He gathered his papers. He said something about giving me time to find a new place, generous to the last, not knowing that the place he stood in was already mine. And then he did the thing that set the final act in motion. He went to his mother's house to tell her the good news. I was not there, of course. But I have heard the account of what happened in that kitchen so many times, from so many sources, that I can tell it to you as though I stood in the corner and watched. Daniel arrived flushed with the courage of a hard thing done. He found Diane at the counter, and Harold in his chair, and he told them. He told them about the divorce, and about Vanessa, and about the twins, his heirs, the Renner grandsons Diane had wanted for so long. He expected joy. He expected his mother to weep with happiness, that the family line would continue at last, even by this crooked path. Diane had wanted grandchildren more than she had wanted almost anything, and Daniel, who understood his mother the way selfish people understand the people they use, expected the news to wash all the ugliness away. But Diane did not weep with joy. Diane went white, because Diane, alone among all of them, had been in the room years ago, when a certain set of papers were signed. Diane had a memory for documents the way some women have a memory for grudges, and as her son stood in her kitchen, crowing about the new life he was building, some cold instinct made her ask the question that would bring the whole thing down. Daniel, she said, when you divorce Claire, What happens to the house? What happens to the company? And Daniel, laughing, said what a man in his position would say. He said the company was his, that it had always been his, that his father was handing it down as planned, that Claire would get a settlement and go. And Diane looked at him, and the color drained from her face, and she said the words that end the hook and open the reckoning. Wait, she didn't tell you? Because Diane remembered. Diane had watched me, years earlier, quietly save the family from Gerald's theft. Diane had signed a document or two herself in that process, trusting the numbers person, and she had never fully understood what she signed, but she had understood enough. She had understood that after Claire fixed things, the way the company was owned had changed. She had asked Harold about it once, and Harold had waved her off, said Claire had set up some sort of protection, some legal thing, nothing to worry about. Diane had worried anyway, in the back of her mind, in the place where old women keep the questions no one will answer for them. And now, watching her son plan to discard the woman who had signed those papers, that buried worry surged to the surface all at once. The company isn't yours, Daniel, she said. Not on paper. I don't think it's your father's either. I think, and here her voice dropped to almost nothing, I think it's hers. I think it's been hers for years. And Daniel laughed again, but the laugh was different now, thinner, because some part of him was doing the math, remembering the papers he had signed with a distracted flourish like a birthday card, remembering that his wife was a numbers person, remembering that he had never once, in 8 years, actually read anything she put in front of him. He had trusted her completely, because he had never imagined she was anything to be afraid of. That was Daniel's final and fatal miscalculation. He drove home that night, to the house he thought was his, in the life he thought was his, and he called me, and his voice was not the smooth voice of the man at the kitchen table anymore. It was the voice of a man who has just felt the floor tilt beneath him for the very first time. I have reconstructed the scene in Diane's kitchen so many times, from so many fragments, from what Harold told me, from what Diane herself eventually admitted, from the shape of what came after, that I can walk you through it minute by minute, and I want to, because it is the emotional center of this whole story, the moment the trap I never meant to lay finally closed. Daniel arrived at his parents' house that Tuesday evening, still warm, with the adrenaline of a hard thing done. He had signed the divorce papers. He had watched his wife sign them. He had delivered the news of Vanessa and the twins with what he surely believed was courage and honesty, and he had emerged from our kitchen feeling, I imagine, cleansed. A man who had finally freed himself from a barren, difficult marriage to build the family he deserved. He drove to his mother's house to receive the reward he had been promised his whole life, her joy. The Renner line would continue. There would be grandsons. Everything his mother had wanted, everything she had made me feel small for failing to provide, he had now provided, and he came to collect his mother's happiness, like a man collecting a debt. Diane was at the counter when he came in, and Harold was in his chair by the window, and Daniel stood in the doorway of that kitchen, the kitchen where I had been corrected and questioned and measured for 8 years, and he told them. He told them about the divorce first, and Diane's face, I am told, did something complicated but not yet alarmed, because Diane had never loved me, and a divorce from the barren wife was not, in itself, unwelcome news to her. Then he told them about Vanessa, about the twins, about the heirs, and he waited for the joy. But Diane did not leap to joy. Diane was a woman who had spent her life managing the appearance of things, and somewhere beneath her snobbery and her small cruelties was a genuine shrewdness about how power and property actually worked, a shrewdness she had needed to marry into the Renners and survive there. And as Daniel spoke of his bright new future, some cold administrative instinct in the back of Diane's mind raised its hand and asked a question that cut straight through the celebration. She set down whatever she was holding. She looked at her son, and she said, "Daniel, if you're divorcing Claire, what happens to the company? What happens to this house?" And Daniel laughed. I can hear the laugh. It was the laugh of a man who has never once had to think about the answer to that question, because the answer had always been obvious. The company was his. The house was his family's. These things were his by birth, and by right, and by the simple fact of being a Renner man. "The company's mine, Mom," he said. "It's always been mine. Dad's handing it down because like Diane had never loved me. Claire gets a divorce from the barren wife was not in itself unwelcome. And that is when Diane went white. Then he told them about Vanessa. Diane remembered. about
She
the
remembered
twins,
the year the
about
numbers
the
person
heirs,
saved them from
and
Gerald.
he waited for the joy.
She remembered
But
signing
Diane
something
did not
herself
leap to
in that
joy.
process. Diane was a woman who had spent her life managing the appearance of things, and somewhere beneath her snobbery and her small cruelties was a genuine shrewdness about how power and property actually worked, a shrewdness she had needed to marry into the Renners and survive there. And as Daniel spoke of his bright new future, some cold administrative instinct in the back of Diane's mind raised its hand and asked a question that cut straight through the celebration. She set down whatever she was holding. She looked at her son, and she said, "Daniel, if you're divorcing Claire, what happens to the company? What happens to this house?" And Daniel laughed. I can hear the laugh. It was the laugh of a man who has never once had to think about the answer to that question, because the answer had always been obvious. The company was his. The house was his family's. These things were his by birth, and by right, and by the simple fact of being a Renner man. "The company's mine, Mom," he said. "It's always been mine. Dad's handing it down like he always planned. Claire gets a settlement and she goes. That's how it works." And that is when Diane went white, because Diane remembered. She remembered the year the numbers person saved them from Gerald. She remembered signing something herself in that process, some document she had not fully read, trusting Claire the way you trust the help. She remembered asking Harold about it once, and Harold waving her off. Claire set up some protection, some legal thing. Don't worry about it. She had worried anyway, in the buried place where she kept the questions no one would answer. And now, watching her son plan to discard the woman whose signature controlled all of it, that buried worry erupted into terrible certainty. She looked at her son, and she understood, all at once, what he in his arrogance had never even thought to check. And she said the words that end the hook and open the reckoning. Quiet, disbelieving, almost pleading. "Wait, she didn't tell you?" And then, when he only stared at her, uncomprehending, she said it plainly, the thing that would haunt him. "Daniel, the company isn't yours." "I don't think it ever was, not since Gerald. I think it's hers. I think it's been Claire's for years. And you just—" her voice failed her. "You just divorced her." Harold, from his chair by the window, said nothing at all. Harold had known, in the way that men like Harold know things they have chosen not to examine. He had signed the papers too, years ago, grateful and exhausted, and he had let himself not understand what he was signing, because understanding would have meant reckoning with the fact that his son's inheritance now belonged to his son's wife. Harold had spent years in comfortable not knowing, and now, watching his wife go white and his son go still, Harold simply closed his eyes, because the not knowing was over, and there was nothing left to do but feel the weight of what had always been true. "Claire," he said, and I could hear his mother's kitchen in his voice, the echo of a question he could not unask. "Claire, my mother's saying something crazy. About the company. About the ownership. I told her she's confused, that she's getting old, but—" and he laughed the thin laugh again. "But you'd tell me if there was anything, right? If there was some paperwork thing? I mean, whatever's happening between us, you'd tell me." I let the silence stretch. Silence is a tool, and I had learned to use it. Then I said gently, in the voice I had used for 8 years, the soft voice that made people forget I was in the room, "Daniel, why don't you have your lawyer look into it? That's what lawyers are for." And I hung up. I did not gloat. I did not explain. I gave him nothing to hold on to, nothing to argue with, nothing to work his considerable charm against. I gave him only the vast and dawning silence of a man who has just realized he cannot see the edges of the hole he has dug. He did have his lawyer look into it. Of course he did. And over the following days, as the lawyer pulled the records and traced the ownership structure and arrived, document by document, at the same conclusion Diane had blurted out in her kitchen, Daniel's world began to come apart in exactly the slow, quiet, irreversible way I had designed it to. Renner Freight, every truck, every warehouse, the office where Daniel had played at being an executive for a decade, was owned, in full and without ambiguity, by a holding company whose sole controlling member was me. The house where Harold and Diane lived, folded into the company assets decades ago, was mine. Daniel had, in the most literal legal sense, nothing. He had spent his whole life believing he was the prince of a kingdom, and he had never noticed that the deed to the kingdom had quietly changed hands, and that he had signed it away himself with a distracted flourish. But I had not been idle in those 3 weeks, and there was one more layer that Daniel's lawyer uncovered, one that turned Daniel's panic into something closer to horror. Because Daniel, it turned out, had been preparing his own quiet exit for months. He was not a stupid man, only an arrogant one, and somewhere in the planning of his new life he had begun to move money, skimming from the company, slowly, carefully, building a cushion for himself and Vanessa and the twins, the way a man builds a nest before he flies. He thought he was being clever. He thought he was being invisible. He was doing, in miniature and for himself, exactly what Gerald had done years before. And here is the exquisite thing, the thing that still makes me marvel at the symmetry of it. Every account Daniel had been quietly funneling money into was an account that sat, unknown to him, inside the very holding structure I controlled. He had been hiding money from me by putting it into vessels I owned. He had been stealing from himself and handing it to me and thanking his own cleverness for it. When his lawyer explained this to him, I am told he did not speak for a full minute. He had built his own cage, brick by brick, and locked himself inside, and handed me the key, and never once looked up to see who was watching. I found out about this layer, incidentally, from Renata, who had by then become something more than my friend. She had become my quiet partner in the whole endeavor, the second set of sharp eyes that missed nothing. Renata had noticed the money moving before I had flagged the unusual vendor accounts weeks earlier, and had said nothing, only watched, only documented, the way she did. When she finally showed me the trail, laid out in her careful hand, she looked at me and said the truest thing anyone said in that entire terrible season. He's not just losing. He never understood what game he was playing. And she was right. Daniel had spent 8 years believing he had married a soft woman with a little job. He had built his whole betrayal on that belief. And the belief was the trap, and he had walked into it grinning. I need to pause here and tell you about the money in more detail, because it is the layer of this story that most people find hardest to believe, and yet it is the truest illustration of who Daniel really was underneath the charm. While Daniel was planning to leave me, he was also, simultaneously, planning to protect himself from me, which tells you that some animal part of him understood I was owed something, even as the rest of him prepared to give me nothing. For months before the Tuesday, he had been quietly siphoning money out of the company. Not dramatically. Daniel had watched, years earlier, as I described the Gerald scheme to him over dinner. I had told him about it in general terms, proud in my quiet way of what I had caught, and he had nodded and changed the subject, and, I now understand, filed it away as a technique. He was not original enough to invent his own method of theft. He simply copied the man I had caught. He set up his own gray-named vendors, his own small irregular payments beneath the threshold of notice, his own patient accumulation of a cushion for the new life he was building with my sister. He thought he was being clever. He thought he was being invisible. He thought, above all, that he was being invisible to me, the soft wife, the little job, the woman who would never look closely. Here is the symmetry that I still, years later, find almost too perfect to be real. Every account Daniel funneled that money into lived inside the holding structure I controlled. He did not know the structure existed, so he did not know that the accounts he chose, chosen for their obscurity, their gray plausibility, their invisibility, were obscure and gray and invisible precisely because I had built them years ago as part of the vessel that saved the company. He was hiding money from me by placing it into containers I owned. Every dollar he stole to protect himself from me, he handed directly to me and congratulated himself on his cunning. When Priya finally explained this to him, in that 90-minute meeting, I am told he asked her to repeat it twice, not because he had not heard, but because his mind could not accept the geometry of it. He had built a second crown for himself in secret, and set it on his own head, and it was made entirely of my gold, and he had never once looked up to see whose vault he was standing in. Renata found it before I did. I have to give her that, because she has never once claimed the credit, and it belongs to her. She had been watching the vendor accounts for months as part of her quiet investigation, and she recognized the pattern immediately, recognized it as the Gerald scheme reborn, recognized Daniel's hand in it, and recognized, with a grim delight she only admitted to me much later, exactly where the money was going. She said nothing, only documented, only watched the trail grow, letting Daniel dig his own hole deeper with every passing week. When she finally laid it out for me, she said the thing I have already told you, the thing that summed up the whole affair. He's not just losing. He never understood what game he was playing. And then she said something else, quieter, that I have never repeated until now. She said, "You know the worst part, Claire? He thinks he's the smart one. He's going to think that for the rest of his life. He's going to lose everything and never once understand that he did it to himself." And she was right. That, in the end, was Daniel's true punishment. Not the loss of the money, or the company, or the house, but the permanent, unshakable belief that he had been cheated, when in fact he had simply been seen. Let me ask you something here, while we sit in the middle of it. Have you ever known a person like Daniel, someone so certain of their own cleverness that they could not imagine being outmatched by the very person they underestimated? Someone who mistook another's silence for stupidity, another's patience for weakness? I would truly love to know. Tell me in the comments about the moment you realized the quiet one in the room was the one holding all the cards, because I think there are more of us than the loud ones ever suspect. What followed was not dramatic in the way people expect drama to be. There was no shouting match in a courtroom, no single explosive scene where I stood and delivered a speech and watched my enemies weep. Real ruin is quieter than that, and slower, and far more thorough. Ruin is paperwork. Ruin is a series of certified letters. Ruin is a woman in a good suit named Priya, sitting across a conference table from Daniel's increasingly desperate lawyer and explaining, with devastating patience, exactly what the document said. Priya moved with the calm of someone who has already won and is merely completing the formalities. First came the confirmation of ownership, the holding structure laid bare, every asset accounted for, my control absolute and unassailable. Then came the matter of the money Daniel had moved, which Priya characterized, accurately, as the misappropriation of company funds. The company being mine, the funds being mine, Daniel had not been building a nest. He had been committing a crime against me, documented in his own careful hand. Priya did not need to threaten prosecution. She merely laid the possibility on the table, the way you might set down a loaded thing, and let Daniel's lawyer understand its weight. Daniel would sign whatever I put in front of him now. The man who had slid divorce papers across our kitchen table with such confidence would spend the coming months signing away everything he had ever believed was his, in his own distracted hand, having finally learned to read the fine print far too late. Harold and Diane were, as I had foreseen, standing too close. The house was mine, and while I did not throw them into the street, I am not cruel, whatever else I am. I did make it clear, through Priya, that they would live there henceforth on terms I set, in a home they no longer owned, at the pleasure of the daughter-in-law they had treated as a defective appliance. Diane, who had spent 8 years making me feel small in her kitchen, would spend the rest of her life aware that the kitchen was mine. There is a justice in that quieter and more complete than any eviction. Harold, to his credit, called me one evening, and did not make excuses, and said only, "You saved this family once, and we never thanked you, and now I understand what we did." It was the closest thing to an apology I received from any of them, and I let it be enough, because Harold, alone among them, had once trusted the numbers person. And then there was Vanessa, my sister. I had thought, going in, that facing her would be the hardest part, that whatever cold clarity carried me through Daniel would crack when I stood before the woman I had grown up beside, the woman I had celebrated, the woman whose children I had wept with joy to learn of. But when I finally saw Vanessa, months into the unraveling, I did not feel the crack I had braced for. I felt something I had not expected. I felt pity, because Vanessa, it turned out, had been used almost as thoroughly as I had. Here is the twist I had not seen coming, the one even Renata uncovered only late. Daniel had never intended to build a lasting life with my sister. Vanessa had been, to him, a means, a young and fertile and adoring means to the heir his pride demanded and his body could not produce. The donor arrangement, the clinic 2 hours away, the careful funding of it all, Daniel had orchestrated a way to have his Renner heirs, while keeping Vanessa exactly as dependent and disposable as he needed her to be. In the weeks after everything collapsed, when Daniel discovered he had lost the company,
the house, the money, the entire foundation of the life he had promised her, he did to Vanessa precisely what he had done to me. He began, coldly and immediately, to plan his exit from her. My sister, who had betrayed me so completely, who had smiled at me over lunch while carrying the proof, found herself abandoned and penniless, with 2 infants and a man who had never loved her, only used her, and who was now casting about for whoever might be useful next. She had traded her sister for a man who would trade her for anyone. I want to tell you, in more detail, exactly how Daniel discarded my sister, because the symmetry of it is the closest thing to justice the universe offered without my having to lift a hand, and because Vanessa's slow realization of what she had traded her life for is a story worth sitting with. When the company turned out to be mine, and the money turned out to be mine, and the house turned out to be mine, Daniel found himself, for the first time in his charmed life, with nothing. No inheritance, no fortune, no fallback. And a man like Daniel, stripped of everything that made him Daniel, does not become humble. He becomes a predator looking for the next host. Vanessa had been useful to him when she was young and adoring, and could give him the heirs his pride demanded. But a young woman with 2 infants and no money is not useful to a man in free fall. She is ballast. And so Daniel began, coldly and immediately, to do to my sister exactly what he had done to me: the distance, the lateness, the warmth withdrawn, the quiet search for whoever might be useful next. Vanessa, who had watched him do it to me and told herself she was different, that she was the one he truly loved, discovered that she was not different at all. She was simply the second woman to learn that Daniel loved no one, had never loved anyone, was constitutionally incapable of the thing. She told me about it at my kitchen table, that gray afternoon, and I confess I felt a vertigo listening to her describe it, because she was describing my own marriage back to me, beat for beat, without seeming to fully realize she was doing it: the withdrawn affection, the unexplained absences, the dawning, sickening understanding that the man across the breakfast table was performing a life rather than living one. She had done to me what he was now doing to her, and she was living my grief a second time, from inside it, and somewhere in the telling I watched her understand that too. "I keep thinking," she said, "about how you must have felt, all those years, and I'm ashamed to say I never once really thought about it until it was happening to me." That was, I think, the first fully honest thing my sister had said to me in a decade. It cost her everything to say it. It changed nothing, and it changed everything. Here is the part that matters most. The part because the symmetry of it is the closest thing to justice the universe offered without my having to lift a hand, and because Vanessa's slow realization of what she had traded her life for is a story worth sitting with. When the company turned out to be mine, and the money turned out to be mine, and the house turned out to be mine, Daniel found himself, for the first time in his charmed life, with nothing. No inheritance, no fortune, no fallback. And a man like Daniel, stripped of everything that made him Daniel, does not become humble. He becomes a predator looking for the next host. Vanessa had been useful to him when she was young and adoring, and could give him the heirs his pride demanded. But a young woman with 2 infants and no money is not useful to a man in free fall. She is ballast. And so Daniel began, coldly and immediately, to do to my sister exactly what he had done to me: the distance, the lateness, the warmth withdrawn, the quiet search for whoever might be useful next. Vanessa, who had watched him do it to me and told herself she was different, that she was the one he truly loved, discovered that she was not different at all. She was simply the second woman to learn that Daniel loved no one, had never loved anyone, was constitutionally incapable of the thing. She told me about it at my kitchen table, that gray afternoon, and I confess I felt a vertigo listening to her describe it, because she was describing my own marriage back to me, beat for beat, without seeming to fully realize she was doing it: the withdrawn affection, the unexplained absences, the dawning, sickening understanding that the man across the breakfast table was performing a life rather than living one. She had done to me what he was now doing to her, and she was living my grief a second time, from inside it, and somewhere in the telling I watched her understand that too. "I keep thinking," she said, "about how you must have felt, all those years, and I'm ashamed to say I never once really thought about it until it was happening to me." That was, I think, the first fully honest thing my sister had said to me in a decade. It cost her everything to say it. It changed nothing, and it changed everything. Here is the part that matters most, the part I want you to hold on to. I did not engineer Daniel's abandonment of Vanessa. I did not have to. I had taken the company and the money and the house, yes. I had used the tools I built to reclaim what was mine and to ensure that the two of them lost the life they had schemed to build. But the specific, intimate cruelty of Daniel discarding my sister the way he had discarded me, that was not my doing. That was simply Daniel being Daniel, freed at last from the wealth that had disguised his nature, revealing to Vanessa the exact same emptiness he had revealed to me. The universe did not need my help to punish my sister. It only needed to remove the money and let Daniel be himself. And the punishment arrived on its own, more fitting and more complete than anything I could have designed. There is a lesson in that, I think, for anyone who has ever lain awake plotting the downfall of someone who wronged them. Sometimes you do not have to build the trap. Sometimes you only have to remove the disguise and let the person you are waiting to see punished simply be who they have always been. The cruelty is already in them. Take away what hides it, and it does your work for you. I did not gloat over my sister's ruin. I want to be clear about that, because it would be easy, in a story like this, to relish it. But I had held that woman through nightmares when she was small. I could not fully relish watching her live my own worst years in miniature, even knowing she had earned every hour of it. What I felt, watching Vanessa understand at last what she had traded her life for, was closer to a terrible sadness. The sadness of watching someone learn, far too late and at far too high a price, a truth you tried your whole life to protect them from. I could not save her from it. I am not sure I would have, even if I could. But I did not enjoy it, and the fact that I did not enjoy it is, I have come to believe, the last thing that separated me from the people who did this to me. They enjoyed my suffering. I did not enjoy theirs. That difference is small, and it is the whole distance between who they are and who I chose to remain. Vanessa came to me. I did not seek her out. I had no need to. She came to my door on a gray afternoon in the fall, thinner than I remembered, with the hollow look of a woman who has not slept a full night in months, and she stood on my step, and she wept before she had said a single word. I let her in. I do not entirely know why. Perhaps because she was still my sister, and blood is a stubborn thing, and even the deepest betrayal does not fully sever what a childhood built. Perhaps because I wanted to hear her say it. Perhaps because I had already won so completely that I could afford to open the door. She told me everything, sitting at the same kitchen table where Daniel had slid me the papers. She told me how it had started, how Daniel had turned to her during my treatments, how he had made her feel chosen and special and adult, how he had convinced her that I was cold, that our marriage was already dead, that she was not stealing anything but merely accepting what I had abandoned. She told me how the guilt had eaten her for 3 years, how she had almost confessed a dozen times, how the words had risen in her throat at that very lunch when I cried with joy for her, and how she had swallowed them because she was afraid. She told me she had believed Daniel loved her. She had believed the twins would bind them, that she would be the wife who gave him what I could not, that she would step into a life of ease and belonging. And she told me how, when the money vanished and the company turned out to be mine, Daniel had looked at her one morning over the crying of the babies, and she had seen, for the first time, that he did not love her at all, had never loved her, had only needed her for a while. I did to you what he's doing to me, she said, and I deserve it. But Claire, the babies didn't. That was the thing that undid my composure, the only thing in the whole long reckoning that reached past the cold clarity and touched something older. The babies didn't. 2 infants who had not chosen any of this, who carried my sister's blood and, through the donor, no blood of Daniel's at all, who would grow up in the wreckage the adults around them had made. I sat with that for a long time while my sister wept at my table. I had won everything. I owned the company, the house, the money, the whole world these people had schemed to take from me. I could have let Vanessa drown in the consequences of her own choices, and no one, not one person alive, would have called it anything but justice. I want to be honest with you about what I did, because this is where the story stops being about revenge and starts being about something I am still learning the name of. I did not rescue Vanessa. I did not forgive her. Not then, perhaps not fully even now. What I did was smaller and more complicated than forgiveness. I set up a trust for the children, a modest,
controlled, ironclad trust, administered by Priya, that would see to their needs and their education and nothing more. Not a penny of it would ever pass through Daniel's hands or reward Vanessa's betrayal. It existed for two people who had done nothing, and it existed on my terms, because everything, by then, existed on my terms. I told Vanessa she could stay in a small property the company owned across town, and that she would raise her children there, and that she and I would not pretend to be sisters again, but that the children would not starve for the sins of their parents. And then I told her to go home. She went. She thanked me, weeping, at the door, and I did not weep back, and I closed the door, and I stood in my kitchen, for a long time in the quiet. I have been asked whether that makes me good. I do not think it does, particularly. I think it makes me a woman who decided what kind of monster the situation had made her, and chose the smallest available version. There is a difference between mercy and weakness, and there is a difference between justice and cruelty, and the whole art of a life, I have come to believe, is learning to stand in the narrow space between them without falling into either. Daniel fell into cruelty. Vanessa fell into weakness. I tried in the end to stand. Before I tell you the rest of what became of Vanessa, I need to take you back, because you cannot understand my choice at the end unless you understand what my sister was to me before she became the woman at my kitchen table begging. We shared a room until I was 16. In the narrow gray house, there was no money for 2 bedrooms, and so Vanessa and I grew up an arm's length apart in the dark. And I want you to know that I loved her then, with the uncomplicated ferocity of an older sister raising a younger one, in the gaps a vanished father and an exhausted mother left behind. I braided her hair for school. I helped her with homework she found impossible, and I found easy. When she had nightmares, she climbed into my bed, and I held her, small and warm and trusting, and I promised her that I would always take care of her, and I meant it with my whole 9-year-old heart. Vanessa was the first person I ever loved on purpose, the first person I ever chose to protect, and some part of that promise never fully died in me, not even at the end, not even when she had done the unforgivable. That is why the betrayal cut the way it did. It was not only that she took my husband, it was that she took him while wearing the face of the sister I had braided and comforted and protected. She used the very trust I had built in that shared dark bedroom as the instrument of my erasure. When she sat across from me at that lunch and let me weep with joy over her pregnancy, she was trading on 30 years of a love I had given freely, spending it down to nothing to buy herself a life she thought she wanted. The child I had held through nightmares grew into the woman who gave me the worst nightmare of my life, and let me thank her for it. And yet, when she came to my door that gray afternoon in the fall, thinner and hollowed out, and weeping before she spoke, I did not see only the woman who had betrayed me. I saw, underneath, the small girl climbing into my bed. I have thought a great deal about whether that was weakness on my part, whether a stronger woman would have felt nothing, would have closed the door, would have let her drown. But I have come to believe that the capacity to still see the child in the person who wronged you is not weakness. It is the most expensive thing a heart can do, and it costs more than any hatred ever could. I did not forgive her. I want to be very clear about that, because I think forgiveness is a word people throw at situations like mine to make them tidier than they are. I did not forgive Vanessa. What I did was refuse to let her betrayal turn me into someone who could let 2 innocent babies suffer, and refuse to let it turn me into someone who could shut the door on the child I once held in the dark. Those are different things from forgiveness. They are, I think, harder. She lives across town now, in the small property the company owns, raising the twins in circumstances far humbler than the life Daniel promised her. We are not sisters again, not in any way that matters. We do not share holidays. Our mother, who favored Vanessa her whole life, has never fully understood what happened, and I have not tried to make her. Some truths are too heavy to hand to an aging woman who would only carry them badly. But the twins have what they need, through the trust, on my terms, administered by Priya, untouchable by either of their parents. And on the rare occasions I see them, for I do see them sometimes, from a careful distance, I feel something I have no clean name for. Not love, exactly. Not indifference. Something like the ache of a promise made in a dark bedroom 30 years ago, still faintly echoing, refusing to fully die, even now. Daniel did not go quietly, at first. Men like Daniel never believe, until the very last document is signed, that the world will truly hold them accountable. He hired a second lawyer, and then a third, each one more expensive and less confident than the last, and each one arrived at the same conclusion the first had. The woman he had discarded owned everything, the paperwork was flawless, and the money he had moved had transformed him from a wronged husband into a man one filing away from a criminal charge. His lawyers advised him to settle, to sign, to walk away with the small dignity of not going to prison. And so, over the course of a long and humiliating autumn, Daniel signed. He signed away his claim to the company. He signed acknowledgement of the funds he had taken. He signed, in the end, a quiet agreement that kept him out of a courtroom in exchange for keeping his hands off everything he had ever believed was his. He lost the company he had played at running. He lost the house he had grown up in, though I let his parents remain in it. He lost the money he had squirreled away, since it had never left my reach. He lost Vanessa, or rather he discarded her, and then found there was no one left to catch him. And he lost, most bitterly of all, the story he had told himself about who he was, the prince, the heir, the man who chose and was chosen, the man too clever and too charming to ever be caught. I heard, some months later, that he had left Cedar Falls entirely, that he had gone to another city to start again with nothing, that he told people there a version of events in which he was the victim of a scheming ex-wife who had somehow stolen his family's company. I did not correct the story. Let him carry it. A lie you tell to survive is its own kind of prison, and Daniel will live in that one for the rest of his life, always the wronged man, never the fool who signed his kingdom away, with a distracted flourish, because he could not imagine his soft-spoken wife was anything to fear. Diane never apologized, not in words, but she changed. The woman who had made me feel small in her kitchen grew quiet around me, careful, aware at last of the true arrangement of power in the family she had ruled. We are not close. We will never be close. But there is a kind of respect that grows in the absence of illusion, and Diane and I have that now, the respect of two women who finally understand exactly where they stand. Harold's one honest phone call remained the truest thing any of them ever gave me, and when he passed, 2 years later, I paid for the funeral, because he had once trusted the numbers person, and because I could afford to be the kind of woman who pays for the funeral of a man whose family tried to erase her. That, too, was a kind of victory, quieter than the rest. Renata and I are closer than ever. She was the one who saw when I could not, who pulled the threads, who loved me enough to bring me the worst news of my life, because she believed I deserved truth more than comfort. She was right. I did. Everything I salvaged because a sharp-eyed friend refused to let me keep believing a comfortable lie about myself. I have thought often about what she said that first night, that I deserve the truth more than I deserve to be comfortable, and I have come to believe it is the kindest thing one person can offer another. Comfort is easy. Truth is love. Renata sits at my kitchen table now most Sundays, and we drink our tea, and sometimes we do not even speak of any of it, and that is its own quiet miracle. People imagine revenge as a moment, a confrontation, a reveal, a face coming apart in real time. But the revenge I took, if revenge is even the right word for simply allowing the truth of ownership to assert itself, was not a moment, it was a season. It was months of certified letters and conference rooms, and the slow, grinding, beautiful machinery of the law, doing exactly what the documents told it to do. Let me walk you through it, because there is a satisfaction in the slowness that the quick version cannot give you. The first letter went out 3 days after the Tuesday. It was not from me. I never once contacted Daniel directly after that phone call. It was from Priya, on heavy letterhead, and it did nothing but request, politely, a meeting to clarify certain matters pertaining to the ownership structure of Renner Freight in light of the pending dissolution of marriage. That sentence, so bland, so procedural, must have landed in Daniel's hands like a stone through a window, because Daniel had, by then, already heard his mother's question in the kitchen. He had already had his first lawyer glance at the structure and go quiet. He already suspected. And now here was formal confirmation that the suspicion had a shape, and a name, and a woman in a good suit prepared to walk him through it. The meeting itself, I am told, for I did not attend, my absence was itself a message, lasted 90 minutes, and Daniel's lawyer said almost nothing after the first 20. Priya laid out the holding structure the way a surgeon lays out instruments, in order, each one gleaming. Here is the entity that owns the company. Here is the sole controlling member. Here are the signatures, including your client's, on the documents that created it. Here is the house, folded into the assets. Here, if you would like to discuss it, is the matter of the funds your client has recently been moving, which we would characterize, and here, Priya would have paused, letting the silence do the work, as the misappropriation of assets belonging to my client. Would your client prefer to discuss a settlement, or would he prefer that we discuss the funds with someone other than ourselves? The elegance of it was that I never had to threaten anything. The documents threatened everything on my behalf. I simply had to have built them correctly, years before, in love, and then wait. Daniel fought, in the way a man fights when he cannot accept that the ground is truly gone. He hired the second lawyer, then the third. He alleged, at various points, that I had defrauded the family, an accusation in the kitchen. He had already had his first lawyer glance at the structure and go quiet. He already suspected. And now here was formal confirmation that the suspicion had a shape, and a name, and a woman in a good suit prepared to walk him through it. The meeting itself, I am told, for I did not attend, my absence was itself a message, lasted 90 minutes, and Daniel's lawyer said almost nothing after the first 20. Priya laid out the holding structure the way a surgeon lays out instruments, in order, each one gleaming. Here is the entity that owns the company. Here is the sole controlling member. Here are the signatures, including your client's, on the documents that created it. Here is the house, folded into the assets. Here, if you would like to discuss it, is the matter of the funds your client has recently been moving, which we would characterize, and here, Priya would have paused, letting the silence do the work, as the misappropriation of assets belonging to my client. Would your client prefer to discuss a settlement, or would he prefer that we discuss the funds with someone other than ourselves? The elegance of it was that I never had to threaten anything. The documents threatened everything on my behalf. I simply had to have built them correctly, years before, in love, and then wait. Daniel fought, in the way a man fights when he cannot accept that the ground is truly gone. He hired the second lawyer, then the third. He alleged, at various points, that I had defrauded the family, an accusation that collapsed the moment anyone looked at the fact that I had saved the company from Gerald and been thanked for it, with signatures, at the time. He alleged coercion, which was laughable given that he could not remember signing anything at all, having signed everything I ever put in front of him with the distracted flourish of a man too important to read. He alleged, finally and most desperately, that surely his father's intentions counted for something, that Harold had always meant for the company to pass to Daniel, but intentions are not deeds, and a man's meaning to is worth nothing against a woman's signature on. Each allegation cost him money he no longer had, and each one failed, and with each failure I watched, through Priya's careful reports, the great certainty of Daniel's life drained slowly away, replaced by something I recognized, because I had lived in it for 8 years, the dawning understanding that you are not the person you believed yourself to be, and that the story you told yourself about your own life was never true. Of all the people in this story, Harold Renner is the one I find hardest to sort into a clean category, and I have come to believe that the difficulty is itself the point. Harold was not a good man in the way we like our good men. He had built his whole life on the assumption that his son would inherit a kingdom, and he had never once questioned whether I was more than a vessel for the next generation of it. He sat at the head of those dinner tables while his wife measured me and found me wanting, and he did not intervene, because intervening was not a thing that occurred to men of Harold's generation and Harold's certainties. In the ledger of how the Renners treated me, Harold has entries on the wrong side. And yet, Harold was the one who brought me the box of books. Harold was the one who, alone in the family, trusted the numbers person with the thing he loved most, the company his father had built, because some part of him recognized that I could see what no one else could see. When I saved Renner Freight from Gerald's theft, Harold thanked me privately, awkwardly, in the hallway after a dinner, gripping my hand too hard and saying, "I don't know what we'd have done, Claire. I don't know what we'd have done." He did not understand the full shape of what I had done, that in saving the company I had come to own it, but he understood that I had saved it, and he was grateful in a way that Diane and Daniel, in all their years of taking me for granted, never once were. When everything collapsed, Harold did not fight me,
He did not join Daniel's parade of lawyers and allegations. Instead, one evening he called me. I almost did not answer. I had schooled myself against contact with any of them. But something made me pick up, and Harold's voice on the other end was old in a way I had not heard before, stripped of the gruff certainty that had defined him. He did not make excuses. He did not plead his son's case. He said only, "You saved this family once, and we never thanked you properly. And now I understand what we did. We looked right at you for 8 years, and we never once saw you. I'm an old man, and I've been a fool, and I wanted to say it while I still could." I did not know what to say. I said thank you, which was inadequate, and we sat on the phone in a silence that was not uncomfortable, two people who finally understood each other too late. It was the only apology I received from any of them, and it was enough, because it was real. Harold died 2 years later. His heart, in the end, the way it so often is with men who spend their lives certain, and then spend their final years in the harder work of understanding. Diane called me, which surprised me, and I paid for the funeral, every cost, without being asked, quietly, the way I do everything. People found it strange, I know. The daughter-in-law who owned everything, paying to bury the father of the man who had betrayed her. But I did not do it for Daniel, and I did not do it for Diane. I did it for the man who once handed me a box of books and trusted the numbers person, and who had the rare courage, at the very end, to say out loud that he had been wrong. There are not many such men. When you find one, even one who wronged you, even one who came to his understanding far too late, I have learned that it costs you nothing to honor the moment he became honest. And it buys you something I do not have a better word for than peace. I stood at the back of that funeral, in a good suit, having paid for every flower, and I watched Daniel, returned briefly to Cedar Falls, diminished, telling anyone who would listen his version where he was the victim, and I felt nothing for him at all, not hatred, not triumph, nothing. And I realized, standing there, that this was the true end of the story. Not the day I took the company, not the day the papers were signed. This, the day I could stand in the same room as the man who had tried to erase me, and feel the vast, quiet peace of a woman to whom he no longer mattered at all. That is what winning actually looks like, in the end. It does not look like his ruin. It looks like your indifference. Have you ever reached that place with someone who hurt you, the place past anger, past even the wish for their downfall, to the quiet shore of simply not caring anymore? It is the hardest place to reach and the most peaceful place to live. If you have reached it, or if you are still fighting your way toward it, I would love to hear where you are on that journey. Tell me in the comments. We are a community of people who understand exactly how long that road can be. If you are still with me, all this way into my story, then I suspect you are carrying a story of your own, because people do not sit through a tale like mine unless some part of it is knocking on a door inside them. So let me set down the plates I have been carrying and speak to you directly for a moment, the way I would if you were sitting across my kitchen table with a cup of tea, going cold between us. The first thing I know now, that I did not know then, is that being underestimated is not the insult it feels like. For most of my life I experienced it as a wound. The teacher who overlooked me, the mother who needed my sister more, the husband who called my profession a little job, the family who saw me only as a vessel. Every one of those dismissals hurt, and I will not pretend they did not. But here is what I understand now that I could not understand while I was inside the hurt. Every person who underestimated me handed me an advantage they did not know they were giving. They spoke freely around me. They signed things in front of me. They forgot I was in the room, and in the forgetting, they showed me exactly how they were built and exactly where they were weak. The whole time they thought they were looking down on me. They were standing in full view of a woman who saw everything. Do not let anyone convince you that being underestimated is the same as being small. Very often, it is the quietest kind of power there is, if you can bear the loneliness of it long enough to use it well. The second thing I know now is that the things we build in love do not disappear when the love does. I built the holding structure to protect a family, out of genuine care, expecting nothing. When that family tried to destroy me, the thing I built in love became the thing that saved me. Not because I had been secretly scheming, but because a genuine act of protection is a genuine act of protection, and it holds its shape no matter what the people you protected later become. If you are a person who builds things quietly for others,
who protects the vulnerable thing, who does the unseen work that keeps a family or a company or a marriage standing. Do not despair that no one notices. The work is real, whether or not it is seen. And the day may come, as it came for me, when the invisible thing you built turns out to be the very ground you stand on. The third thing I know now is the hardest, and it is about who you choose to become when someone gives you every reason to become a monster. I had the power, at the end, to be as cruel as they had been. I chose not to be, not because they deserved my mercy. They did not, but because I did not deserve to lose myself. Cruelty would have been a second theft, this time from me, by me. The people who wronged me had already taken 8 years, a marriage, a sister, a dream of children. I would not let them also take the woman I had spent my whole life being. That is the choice, in the end, that every betrayed person faces, and it is a choice no lawyer and no fortune can make for you. You can win and remain yourself, or you can win and become them. I chose to remain myself, and it is the only part of this whole story I would not change for anything. And the last thing I know, the thing I most want to leave with you, wherever you are watching from tonight, is this. The moment they think they have taken everything from you may be the exact moment you discover that everything was yours all along. Daniel slid those papers across the table, believing he was stripping me of my last possession, and in that very moment, I was the wealthiest person in the room, and the only one who knew it. Your worth was never in their hands to give or take. It was always yours. They can withhold their recognition of it for a lifetime, and it changes nothing, because recognition is not the same as reality, and you are real whether or not they ever see you. Read the fine print of your own life. Trust the numbers over the story, and never ever mistake their failure to see your value for the absence of it. I want to tell you about the first morning I walked into Renner Freight as its acknowledged owner, because it was not triumphant in the way you might expect, and the difference matters. I had owned the company, on paper, for years, but there is a vast distance between owning a thing in a document and walking into it as its head, and I crossed that distance on an ordinary Monday, in a good suit, carrying nothing but a leather folder and the quiet certainty that had carried me through everything. The office fell silent when I entered. Word travels in a company, and by then everyone knew some version of the story, the wife who turned out to own it all, the husband who had signed it away, the quiet accountant who had been the true power the whole time. I could feel them watching me, the men especially, waiting to see whether the soft-spoken woman would know how to run the thing she owned. They had spent years watching Daniel play at being an executive. They did not yet know what I knew, that Daniel had never run the company at all. I had. From the shadows, through the structure, through the numbers. I had been quietly steering Renner Freight for years, and they had simply credited the steering to the man in the corner office because he was the one they expected to see. I did not give a speech. I have never been a woman for speeches. I called a meeting, and I laid out, in plain numbers, exactly where the company stood, the strengths, the weaknesses, the opportunities Daniel had been too incurious to notice. I answered every question with a specificity that made the men who had doubted me go quiet, and then thoughtful, and then slowly, respectful, in the way that people become respectful when they realize they have badly misjudged someone. By the end of that first meeting, the question in the room was no longer whether the quiet woman could run the company. The question was why it had taken so long for anyone to notice she already was. The company thrives now, and I say that not to boast, but because it is the final, quietest vindication of the whole story. Under the men who assumed it was theirs by birthright, Renner Freight had drifted, coasting on the momentum of Daniel's grandfather's 2 trucks and a handshake. Under me, under the watcher, the numbers person, the woman they all underestimated, it has grown more in 3 years than it did in the previous 10. The trucks still carry the Renner name, because a name is only paint, and I saw no reason to spend money changing it. Let it carry the name. The name was never the thing. The deed was the thing, and the deed is mine, and the woman who holds it turned out to be exactly as capable as everyone spent 8 years assuming she was not. I live alone now, and I want to tell you that the aloneness is not the tragedy that Diane, in her worst kitchen moods, would have predicted for me. For years I feared the empty life, the barren, failed, solitary future that everyone treated as my punishment for not producing an heir. I feared it so deeply that I stayed, and bled, and apologized over the bathroom sink, all to avoid it.
And then the empty life arrived, delivered to me by the very people who had used it as a threat, and I discovered the strangest thing. It was not empty at all. It was mine. It was full of work I am good at and proud of. It was full of Renata, who sits at my table most Sundays. It was full of a quiet I chose rather than a quiet that was imposed on me, and the difference between those two quiets is the difference between a prison and a sanctuary, though they can look identical from the outside. Sometimes, late in the evening, I sit in the kitchen, my kitchen, in the house that is legally, unassailably mine, and I think about the woman who whispered apologies over the bathroom sink at 6 in the morning, 8 years of them, 96 months, more failed mornings than she could hold in 2 hands. I think about how certain she was that she was the broken one, and I wish I could reach back through time and sit across from her at the table, and take her hands, and tell her what I know now, that the problem was never her, that the softness they mocked was a strength they could not comprehend, that the watching, the patience, the quiet, all the things they used to make her small, were the very things that would one day give her everything. I cannot reach her. Time does not run backward. But I can reach you, whoever you are, wherever you are watching from, and I can tell you the same thing, and mean it with my whole heart. You are not the broken one. You never were, and the moment they think they have taken everything from you may turn out to be the exact moment you discover that everything was yours all along. People ask me, when they learn some version of this story, whether I planned it, whether I married Daniel knowing, whether I built the holding structure as a weapon, whether the soft-spoken accountant was a schemer in disguise all along. The truth is stranger, and I think, more important than that. I did not plan any of it. I built the thing that saved me out of love, years before I knew I would need it. I protected a family that would one day try to erase me, and in protecting them, I accidentally protected myself. The trap that caught Daniel was not a trap I laid. It was a shelter I built, and he ran into it at full speed, because he could not conceive that the woman he had underestimated for 8 years had built anything at all. That is the lesson I carry now, the one I would hand to you across this table if you were sitting here with your own cup of tea. The world will tell you, especially if you are a woman, especially if you are quiet, especially if you are the kind who lets others speak freely around her, that your softness is a weakness, that your patience is passivity, that the fact that people forget you are in the room means you do not matter. They are wrong. The quiet ones are reading the balance sheet while everyone else is talking. The soft ones are the ones who protect the vulnerable thing, and in doing so, build the very foundation they will one day stand on when the loud ones try to take it all. Do not let anyone convince you that being underestimated is the same as being small. Sometimes it is the greatest advantage you will ever hold. I own the company now, and I run it, and it is thriving in a way it never did under the men who assumed it was theirs by birthright. The trucks still carry the Renner name, because a name is only paint, and the thing that matters is who holds the deed. I did not become the mother I once bled to be, and I have made a strange and hard-won peace with that too, because the life I feared, the empty, failed, barren life they all believed was my punishment, turned out to be full of work I am good at, full of a friendship that saw me clearly and loved me anyway, full of a quiet I chose, in a kitchen that is mine, in a life that no one can slide across a table and take from me again. I signed those divorce papers with a steady hand and a small smile, and Daniel thought he was watching a woman surrender. He was watching a woman come home. And if there is one thing I want you to take from my story, it is this. The moment they think they have taken everything from you may be the exact moment you discover that everything was yours all along. You only have to be brave enough, and quiet enough, and patient enough to read the fine print of your own life. Thank you for sitting with me through all of it. If this story moved you, if any part of it found you where you are, I would love to hear from you. Tell me in the comments, have you ever been underestimated, and had it turn out to be your quiet strength? Have you ever discovered that the thing you built in love became the thing that saved you? I read every one, and there is a whole community of us here who understand exactly what it means to be the quiet one in the room. If you are new here, consider subscribing and staying a while, because we tell stories like this one every week. Stories about the quiet ones, the underestimated ones, the ones who come home to themselves in the end. Take care of yourself. And remember, never let anyone convince you that being underestimated is the same as being small.